The vast, unforgiving plains of Montana stretched endlessly under a sky that hinted at an early autumn chill. Elias Vance, a man carved from the same hard landscape he worked, was mending a fence post on his isolated ranch. His life was a routine of solitary labor, cattle, fences, the occasional trip to town for supplies. He preferred the company of his horses and the quiet hum of the wind to most people. The weathered lines on his face told tales of sun, struggle, and a loneliness he rarely acknowledged. It was late afternoon when he spotted something unusual by his gate, a bundle of rags, or so he thought. As he rode closer, his calloused hand instinctively reached for the worn grip of his revolver. The bundle shifted, revealing a human form. A young woman, naked and exposed to the biting wind, lay crumpled beside a crude wooden sign stuck in the dust. The words, crudely scrawled, sent a jolt through him. "Return to sender." Her skin was pale, chapped from the elements, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She was clearly pregnant, her belly a stark, swollen mound against her thin frame. Elias, despite his gruff exterior, felt a primal shock. No one deserved this, no matter their past. He dismounted cautiously, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of who might have left her. Nothing. Just the vast, empty expanse. He wrestled with his conscience for a moment. This was trouble, plain and simple. A woman, pregnant, abandoned. It invited questions, judgment, and complications he actively avoided. But leaving her to die was not an option. With a sigh that carried the weight of a reluctant responsibility, Elias carefully removed his worn duster, wrapping it around her shivering body. Her eyes fluttered open, wide, and full of a desperate fear he hadn't seen in a long time. She didn't speak, just shivered and tried to pull the coat tighter. He gently lifted her onto his horse, holding her steady as they made the slow journey back to his small, functional cabin. The ride was silent, save for the rhythmic creak of the saddle and the wind whipping around them. Elias's mind raced, trying to make sense of the brutal message, the girl's predicament, and the sudden, overwhelming disruption to his ordered, solitary world. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, a beautiful yet indifferent backdrop to the harsh reality Elias had just brought into his home. Inside Elias's cabin, the air was thick with the scent of old leather and wood smoke. He laid the girl on his cot, the only proper bed in the small space, and quickly built up the fire. Her teeth chattered, and she still clutched his duster, her knuckles white. He found an old, clean flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that might serve as a makeshift dress, laying them out for her. "There's water," he grunted, pointing to a basin on a rough-hewn table. "And some soap. Clean yourself up." He turned his back, giving her what little privacy he could. He heard the rustle of fabric and then the gentle splash of water. When he finally looked again, she was dressed, the oversized clothes hanging loosely on her gaunt frame, her damp hair clinging to her face. She looked younger than he'd first thought, perhaps no more than 18. "What's your name, girl?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She hesitated, her eyes fixed on the flickering firelight. "Clara," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Clara," he repeated, testing the name. He poured her a cup of strong black coffee and offered a plate of cold beans and jerky, not much, but all he had readily available. She ate slowly, meticulously, as if each mouthful was a precious gift. Over the next few days, Elias found himself in an unfamiliar role. Clara was withdrawn, speaking only when absolutely necessary, her past a locked vault. He learned she was close to term, and the reality of an impending birth on his isolated ranch pressed heavily on him. He rode to the nearest homestead, a good half-day's ride, seeking Mrs. O'Malley, a kind-hearted woman known for her knowledge of birthing. Mrs. O'Malley, though wary of the circumstances, agreed to come when the time was right, a rare act of compassion in a world that often turned a blind eye to misfortune. Elias also took to riding the perimeter of his land more frequently, not just for the cattle, but for any sign of those who might have left Clara. The message on the sign gnawed at him. "Return to sender." It spoke of rejection, of a brutal ownership that chilled him. He knew better than to pry into her past. In the West, some secrets were best left buried. But he couldn't shake the feeling that danger, or at least unfinished business, lingered on the horizon. He bought extra supplies in town, a small cradle he haggled for, and even some soft linen. He was preparing for a life he never anticipated, for a small life that would soon depend entirely on him and the reluctant kindness of a stranger. Weeks turned into a harsh November. A blizzard descended upon the ranch, trapping Elias and Clara within the confines of the small cabin. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the single window pane, and snow piled against the door, burying the world outside in a thick white blanket. The isolation, which Elias usually embraced, now felt oppressive, amplifying the tension between them. It was during the peak of the storm, as the last rays of daylight faded, that Clara's labor began. A sharp cry broke the rhythmic groan of the wind. Elias, despite his experience with animals, was utterly unprepared for the raw, visceral ordeal of human childbirth. He cursed the weather, knowing Mrs. O'Malley wouldn't be able to reach them. He was alone. Clara, usually so quiet, was consumed by pain, her small hands gripping the edge of the cot. Elias, guided only by instinct and a desperate urgency, boiled water, tore strips of clean cloth, and tried to remember what little he'd overheard about birthing. The hours that followed were a blur of primal struggle. Clara's cries echoed in the small space, each one a testament to her immense strength and suffering. Elias, sweat beading on his brow, offered words of encouragement he didn't know he possessed, holding her hand, wiping her forehead. He saw not a burden, but a young woman fighting for her life and the life within her. Finally, as dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in hues of soft grey and pink, a new sound cut through the storm's fury, the thin, fragile cry of a newborn, a baby girl. Elias, exhausted and trembling, wrapped the tiny wriggling form in a warm blanket, his eyes fixed on the miracle in his hands. He cut the cord, his movements surprisingly steady. Clara, pale but with a new light in her eyes, reached out a weak hand. "My baby," she whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. Elias gently placed the infant in her arms. In that moment, something shifted between them. The unspoken wall that had stood between the silent rancher and the terrified girl crumbled, replaced by a shared bond forged in the crucible of life and death. Outside, the blizzard began to recede, revealing a world newly blanketed, pristine and quiet, much like the new life that had just entered Elias's home. With the arrival of the baby, whom Clara named Lily, a new rhythm settled into the isolated ranch. Elias found himself surprisingly adept at handling the infant, his large hands gentle as he held and fed her. Clara, though still quiet, slowly began to open up, sharing fragments of her life, though never the full story of her abandonment. She spoke of a strict upbringing, a family obsessed with reputation, and a desperate love that ended in betrayal. The return to sender message now made a chilling, if incomplete, kind of sense. Lily, with her tiny coos and grasping fingers, became a bridge between them. Elias watched Clara with the baby, seeing a fierce, protective love bloom in her, erasing some of the fear that had shadowed her eyes. He found himself softening, his gruff demeanor easing, as he learned to navigate the unpredictable joys and demands of fatherhood, a role he never imagined for himself. Their small community, however, was not without its whispers. Mrs. O'Malley, after finally making it to the ranch once the snow cleared, was a compassionate ally, but word of the unwed mother and the mysterious baby spread through the nearest town like wildfire. Elias overheard hushed conversations in the general store. Speculative glances followed him, and he even faced a blunt inquiry from a stern-faced preacher about his Christian duty and the sin under his roof. Elias, fiercely protective of Clara and Lily, met these challenges with a steely resolve. He had taken them in, and they were under his protection. He knew the strictures of their society, the judgment that could befall those who strayed from the path. But looking at Lily, sleeping peacefully in the cradle he'd bought, and at Clara, slowly regaining her strength, he felt a conviction he hadn't known before. This wasn't about reputation. It was about doing what was right. He recognized the fragility of their newfound peace and the lurking threat of a world that might not understand or accept them. He knew he would have to fight for their place, whatever that meant. Months passed, and spring breathed new life into the plains. The relentless Montana winds softened into a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. Lily was growing, her chubby legs now strong enough for clumsy, joyful toddles across the cabin floor, her laughter a bright, clear sound that filled the small space, chasing away years of silence and echoing in Elias's usually quiet heart. Clara, though still carrying the scars of her past in the way her eyes sometimes clouded over, had blossomed into a resilient young woman. Her spirit, once fragile as a winter bloom, was slowly mending under Elias's quiet protection, nurtured by the simple rhythms of ranch life and the profound love for her child. Their bond had deepened into an unspoken understanding, a partnership forged in adversity and sustained by shared responsibility for Lily. They were a unit, a small, unlikely family carved out of the wilderness. One blustery afternoon, as the sky began to turn a bruised purple, a rider approached the ranch, kicking up a plume of dust that stained the horizon. Elias, wiping sweat from his brow after a long day mending fences, felt a familiar tightening in his gut, a cold, sharp premonition of trouble. The man was a stranger, not a local ranch hand or a traveling peddler. He was dressed in crisp, dark city clothes, utterly out of place in the rugged landscape, and carried an air of self-important authority. He dismounted with an almost theatrical flourish, his gaze sweeping over the weathered cabin and dusty corrals, before settling with an unsettling directness on Clara, who stood near the cabin door, Lily cradled securely in her arms, a bright splash of color against her simple dress. "Clara Davies?" the man asked, his voice formal, resonant with an urban cadence that grated on Elias's ears. Clara stiffened, her face draining of color as if all the blood had rushed from her veins. Her grip on Lily tightened instinctively. Elias, seeing the terror flash in her eyes, didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, placing his broad, imposing frame squarely between the stranger and Clara. "Who's asking?" he demanded, his voice low and guttural, his hand resting with deliberate slowness near the worn grip of his revolver. The action wasn't a threat, but a clear statement of his readiness to protect. The man, unfazed, produced a card from his waistcoat. Elijah Thorne, attorney at law, representing the Davies family of Boston. He then launched into a practiced, well-rehearsed speech. He had been sent to retrieve her, to bring her back to a life of propriety and to ensure the proper arrangements were made for the child. He spoke of scandal, of the family's untarnished reputation, and the absolute necessity of maintaining appearances. He even offered money, a veiled insult disguised as a generous offer to compensate Elias for his trouble, a clear attempt to buy off his loyalty and separate Clara from her child. His words, cold and clinical, cut through the quiet afternoon like a rusty knife, threatening to unravel everything they had built. Clara, though pale, was emboldened by Elias's unwavering, solid presence beside her. A flicker of her newfound defiance ignited in her eyes. She found her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength with each word. "I'm not going anywhere," she stated, her chin rising slightly. "And Lily is staying with me." Her voice, usually soft, now carried a new, unshakable conviction. Elias stood his ground, his gaze unwavering, as fixed and immutable as the mountains to the west. "This is their home now," he said, his voice low and steady, a rumble from deep within his chest. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an unyielding force against the lawyer's polite threats. "They're not going anywhere you don't take them by force. And I assure you, Mr. Thorne, that would be a mistake." The last words hung in the air, a quiet promise of a fight he was prepared to win. The lawyer, realizing the depth of Elias's resolve and Clara's newfound defiance, finally hesitated. He saw the raw, untamed strength in Elias's eyes, the fierce protectiveness in his stance. He saw the unbreakable connection forged between the woman, the child, and this silent, formidable man in the lonely heart of the West. He argued, he cajoled, he even threatened legal action and further reputational damage, but Elias simply stood, a rock against the tide of his empty words. The wind picked up, swirling dust around them, as if the land itself was backing Elias's stand. Eventually, the lawyer, frustrated and clearly outmaneuvered by a man who spoke more with his presence than his words, conceded defeat. With a huff of exasperation, he mounted his horse, grumbling about stubborn frontiersmen and ruined reputations, and rode away, a receding speck of dark cloth against the vastness of the prairie, until he finally disappeared into the setting sun. As the dust settled and the silence, now welcoming, returned to the ranch, Clara turned to Elias. Her eyes, filled with a gratitude that transcended words, shone brighter than the evening star. He simply nodded, a small, rare smile, almost imperceptible, touching his lips. He reached out, his calloused hand gently brushing Lily's soft hair. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in a blaze of fiery glory, casting long, peaceful shadows over their small, resilient home. The future was still uncertain, filled with the challenges of raising a child and living on the fringes of societal norms. But now they faced it together. Elias, the solitary rancher who had sought only isolation, had found a family. Clara, the abandoned girl, had found a home, a protector, and her own voice. And Lily, the child of their unexpected bond, had found a love that promised a new, hopeful horizon in the unforgiving yet ultimately beautiful American West. Their story was just beginning,